Hello and welcome to Europe Weekly. I'm Mariam Zaidi in Brussels. Coming up in the show, could the Irish border break already stalling Brexit negotiations? Journalists Sebastian Ramsbank and Danny Kemp join me for a roundup of stories from across Europe. Will Carles Puigdemont be extradited from Belgium under an EU arrest warrant on December 4th? And if not, what happens if he contests upcoming regional Catalan elections and wins? And finally, a restaurant near Brussels makes food inspired by travel and art. But to eat it, you'd only be given a bowl and a spoon. Now, they say divorce is never easy. 6 negotiating rounds have come and gone, and massive issues have remained over the 3 core issues of separation for Brexit that need to be settled before matters can move forward to discussing trade. Those are the divorce bill, citizen rights post-Brexit for both EU and UK nationals, and the Irish border. Now, December 4th was the latest deadline that EU Council President Donald Tusk had given the UK to finally come up with a Brexit divorce bill offer. A deadline, of course, was put in place so that the EU leaders can greenlight opening trade talks at their EU summit that kicks off on December 14th in Brussels. And it seems that we are now finally here. Reports just coming in suggest that the UK Prime Minister Theresa May and her cabinet are ready to offer around £50 billion to the EU. But even with the money sorted, Ireland could still use its veto to block trade negotiations. Hugues Weinstock has the latest.
British Prime Minister Theresa May has called on the EU to open the second phase of Brexit negotiations and break the deadlock. Many issues remain to be resolved on the divorce settlement, including the rights of EU nationals living in the UK post-Brexit. But the Irish border question is proving now to be the most testing. Ireland has called for Northern Ireland to remain in the customs union. For them, and the EU as a whole, this is the only way to avoid the return to a border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Westminster, on the other hand, is against this proposal, as it would create a new border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK.
Joining me to discuss Brexit are UK Green MEP Molly Scott-Cato and UK Conservative MEP Dan Dalton. Thank you both for joining me. Now, Dan, coming to you first, are we finally there in the money?
Well, it looks like it. I mean, the UK government's put forward a proposal now. It looks like the Commission has accepted the principle of the proposal we've put forward. So it looks positive. It looks like it's opening the door towards moving towards trade negotiations. So
it'll be a good meeting for Theresa May when she comes to Brussels on Monday.
Well, I hope it will be better than some of the previous meetings. I think the door has certainly opened, and hopefully, as I said, this will be the start for us to move towards looking at the next phase.
Sure. Now, Molly, of course, Dan is going to be positive. He's from the Conservative Party. But even if we do get the money sorted out, do you think Ireland will use its veto to block trade talks?
Well, I think the money situation's always been really quite obvious what we should be paying, and the sad thing is that some in the Conservative Party have made this a source of rowing and argument and undermined goodwill when there was no need to do that. But the Irish question is much more intractable. I mean, essentially, there isn't a border there, in which case you've got a huge risk of smuggling into the single market, or there is a border, in which case you put stress on the peace arrangements. So I've always seen that as the most intractable of the 3 issues, and I don't see anybody putting a solution on the table.
Well, I think the problem with the Irish border is it can't really be solved until we discuss exactly what the trade relations are, because the problem on the border is not free movement of people. There's already an agreement between the UK and Ireland over free movement of people between those 2 countries. The problem is the customs checks, and that can only be solved when you talk about trade. I think what the EU
But the thing is that, you know, the UK did sign up to a sequencing.
Yes.
And within that sequencing, the 3 core issues. So they can't really say, but, you know, we can't sort out one of the main issues. Can they really? Or can they?
But the problem is customs. You can't talk about customs until you know what the trade arrangements are. I mean, effectively what the EU is saying is the UK has to give a commitment that the Northern Ireland, for example, would stay in the customs union when the rest of the UK left. Now, that is completely impossible from the UK perspective.
I agree that's impossible. And I mean, to be fair to Dan, you know, people like him argued during the referendum that these kind of arrangements would be incredibly difficult. And what I don't understand is why the Conservative Party now is so determined to leave the customs union. I mean, even Turkey is in the customs union. You know, it would be terribly damaging to businesses in Britain who rely on just-in-time production, as well as the Irish problem. So, I mean, we should just change that decision. We should just be prepared to stay in the customs union and also, in my view, in the single market.
I'm glad you bring that up because I'm going to read you both out a tweet now. This was from someone, I'll reveal who it was later on Twitter. And what they said is that the way to avoid a border in Ireland is to have an overall UK-EU trade deal based on mutual recognition of standards, veterinary checks, etc. So, of course, British people, we love our pets. Those are the talks we ought to be holding. The delay is not on the British side. So, I can reveal to you, are you smiling because you know who it is? Now, this was a tweet, of course, by ECR MEP Daniel Hannan. Now, he seems to be reinventing what is essentially the single market, no?
Well, Daniel Hannan was the person who said during the referendum campaign there is no question of anybody saying we should leave the single market. He's typical of the Brexiteers who have lured people into voting for Brexit on the basis that we'd be able to sort out all these issues in an afternoon. And I think this is why it's absolutely essential that we now we see the complexity and we see how difficult things are going to be. We do have a right to vote and say whether we think that's the deal we thought we voted for and whether we still want that or whether staying in the European Union is still the best option.
Well, there's two problems here. One, the customs union. The UK can't really stay in the customs union when it's outside of the EU because then it has to accept all EU trade deals with third countries for imports, i.e. 0% tariffs on imports coming in from Canada or Japan or Korea or whoever the EU does a deal with. But UK exports will meet the WTO tariff because the UK isn't a signatory to that deal. That is the reason why the UK can't stay in the customs union. And for the single market, I think the problem we have with that is if you're in the single market but not in the EU, you have no say over the rules governing your economy. And that is why, unfortunately, we're in a situation where there is only really one option. If you're leaving the EU, we're going to have to leave the customs union and single market and try and get the closest possible trade and mutual recognition agreement that we possibly can with the EU.
But do you both think that, negotiating Brexit, negotiating divorce of this magnitude is always going to be so difficult? So perhaps it's not so fair that people criticise Theresa May and her cabinet, from which we hear many, many different voices and opinions.
Look, what's completely fair is to say that they have made a real hash of these negotiations, and the reason is they will not put a clear negotiating position on the table. And the reason they can't do that is that the Conservative Party is completely divided internally about what kind of future trading relationship they want. So there are some people who say, if you come out of the customs union, then you won't be able to make these free trade deals. That's true, but other people's are completely gung-ho for some kind of WTO deal, and other people are very worried about the impact of that and the impact of the imposition of tariffs and the ending of this frictionless trade that we enjoy at the moment. So until the Conservatives have a clear position which they agree on, which then becomes the country's position, the negotiations are going to continue to be stalled, and talk about a transition deal doesn't really help with that, because what businesses need to know and what we all need to know is where are we ultimately heading, and at the moment we don't have any clear position on that.
And Dan, do you also maybe worry perhaps, I don't know if you speak to your constituents or people in the UK, do you get a sense that people, even if they voted for Brexit, that they are now getting worried about what's happening and whether the UK can make a success outside of the EU?
I don't think it's as simple as that. I think most of the people who voted leave, from what I can see, still back that, and they still back that position. People are concerned, obviously, about what the trade relations are going to be, but the bottom line is, in the Conservative Party particularly, everyone wants as close to trade relations as possible. Now, what form that takes, we need to decide and we need to discuss over the next year. But the bottom line is everyone wants as close trade relations as possible. And my constituents in general, I don't feel that they've changed their view very much from June last year when the referendum happened.
But the thing is that we are getting to this point where there's still, even if the UK comes up with the money finally, we are facing the prospect at the EU Leaders Summit in December that Ireland could use a veto. Now, if they use a veto or if we have any more problems, we're not sticking to a timetable. And that's getting very tricky, no?
Well, businesses are already saying it's too late, and they're already having to plan for the worst possible outcome, which is going to be bad for jobs in our country. I represent a lot of farmers in the southwest. They are also, they plan years ahead. They don't know what they should be planting, what they'll be able to sell, what the tariffs will be. We needed to have a clear position before we triggered Article 50 so that we could start negotiating on the basis of something rational and possible and acceptable. Whereas I'm afraid we've just been following this crazy idea that we can have our cake and eat it, that we're so important we can just get the EU to cave in. But at every stage, it's actually the UK that's caved in. And that's because the EU is adopting a rational position that actually abides by the law. And we have to learn to do the same.
Do you think that the UK has been caving into the EU? Is it a case of the UK versus 27 disgruntled wives and husbands?
Well, I think the sequencing of negotiations makes it difficult for the UK because the key European issues are in the first tranche of negotiations. The key issues for the UK is the trade deal that comes later. And we can't even discuss that until we deal with the budget and citizens' rights, which are predominantly issues from the European side. So that poses a challenge in the first place. Just to your previous question on Ireland as well, I don't believe that Ireland will use the veto simply because their goal is to avoid a hard border. If they use the veto, they virtually guarantee that there will be a hard border in place because there will possibly be no deal between the UK and the EU. So I think this is more negotiating tactics rather than realistic likelihood of using the veto.
Sure. And then just lastly, help me dispel a myth, if it is a myth. If Brexit continues to go as badly, or negotiations continue to go as badly as they are being perceived to be, can you reverse Brexit?
Well, I've already made clear that I think we have a democratic right to decide between two possible futures. At the moment, people have voted against the EU. Many people voted for Brexit on the basis of a whole range of different issues and disgruntlements and so on, and it was actually nothing to do with the EU for some people. But, you know, we didn't have a clear proposal on the table for what life outside the EU might look like. As that looms over the horizon and we start to see the damage to jobs and the damage to our environment and all the other problems that leaving the EU will bring, then I think we have a right to choose between that and continued EU membership. And I think we absolutely should demand that, and that we should then vote to stay in the EU. So we can definitely leave. We're still the people. We still have an absolute sovereign right to decide whether we want to continue with EU membership or not. And I'm very much pushing for a referendum on the deal to see whether we want to stay in the EU.
Dan?
Well, I mean, Molly's right in terms of in a democracy you can always change your mind, but the reality is I don't think the politics are there in the UK. The two main parties, Conservatives and Labour Party, both support leaving the EU. I don't see substantial changes in the next year and a half.
Even if perhaps Theresa May can't survive beyond Christmas?
I think the Prime Minister's position at the moment is stronger than it's been for a while. I think I don't see that it's unlikely that she would survive at all. I think she's very much likely to survive. But even if she didn't survive, the politics in terms of the numbers in the House of Commons do not change. There is still a majority Conservative DUP in the House of Commons. I don't see a huge change there. So I think it's unlikely, and I also think this is the way EU negotiations work. They always start like this. Both sides start off with their red lines, and you gradually get closer together. When the deadline looms, you get a deal in the dead of the night.
The issue here is this is not a normal council negotiation. I think David Davis is making that mistake, thinking, you can take it to the deadline and beyond. This is a totally different situation. It's much more likely that what the EU will do is create a solution that works for them, which insulates them against the worst damages of a hard Brexit, and they will just hand that to us at the end. And if we haven't come up with anything better, then that's what we'll have to take, because the nature of Article 50 is that the country leaving is always a supplicant and is not an equal negotiating partner. And that's something that we made clear during the referendum campaign, and I'm afraid to say that the Tories haven't really grasped that. And that's one of the reasons they're not carrying on the negotiations very successfully.
Well, the thing is that, can it ever be a fair game when it's 27 versus 1? Well, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you both for joining us on the show. So thanks to, of course, MEPs Molly Scott-Cato and Dan Dalton. Time now to look at what else is happening across Europe. Sifting through the stories that have caught their eye are journalist Sebastian Ramsbeck, the Brussels correspondent for Swiss National Television SRF News, and Brussels Deputy Bureau Chief for the AFP, Danny Kemp. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us on the show. Now, Sebastian, coming to you first, let's start with Germany coalition talks. And especially since we're sitting at the European Parliament, is the former President of the Parliament, Martin Schulz, going to save Merkel's bacon?
I think it will be very, very difficult for him, because he always said that he will not have another grand coalition with Angela Merkel. And I think if there will be a grand coalition, and that's a possible outcome, I think it should be without him.
Danny, what do you think? Schulz or no Schulz?
I think it's unlikely, really. I mean, I think that in a way it would be quite good for some people in the EU. President Macron of France, for example, would quite like to have a kind of massive Europhile like Martin Schulz on side. Schulz has said he would back quite a lot of those reforms that Macron wanted. But again, I'm not sure exactly what Germany needs. I'm not sure it's going to happen either.
So if we don't get the socialists with Angela Merkel, then what? Do we go back to a Jamaica coalition? Do we have elections? What happens to the engine of the EU? And what happens to the EU?
I think there will be maybe a grand coalition, but not with Martin Schulz. Or then there will be another possibility, of course, to have a minority government, which would be something very unusual for the German history, that Merkel is having her own government with her own party only, and then trying to find coalitions per issue. But that, of course, would be a less stable government. But it's something that Merkel has to do on a European level anyway, like finding new coalitions. So maybe she will be quite good in managing power like that.
And so we think Merkel's going to stay in power?
I reckon
50-50.
on balance. Maybe that's more hope than expectation. But,
OK, well, let's go to another big issue, glyphosate. Now, this is, of course, a massive EU scandal. A weed killer's licence has been renewed for 5 years. What do you make of it, Danny?
Well, this is a great story that on the face of it is super boring. It's about weed killer, but it goes to the heart of what the EU is about. It's about consumer rights, it's about protecting the environment. It's also about being protectionist against a big US company. So really, this is actually one of those kind of stories about the EU that you wouldn't expect to be interesting, but it really is. It also ties in quite nicely with the German coalition talks, because you had the German agriculture minister coming in and going, that's fine, no problem, Germany backs this. His bosses in Berlin didn't want this at all. They're from the other part of the prospective coalition. So you've actually had this mess in Berlin with the coalition talks infecting a major part of EU business, which I guess just goes to show how important it is to get the German political situation sorted out.
Because this was the reason why for so long there was no decision, because with the Grand Coalition, with like a left and the right-wing party in power in Germany, they were not able to have a real position on glyphosate, and as Danny rightly put out, I mean, that could be then the case if we have no government.
Let's move on to our last story now. So, EU and Africa. Now, CNN recently uncovered slave auctions in Libya, and that was something that you wanted to talk about, Sebastian.
Well, it's certainly a big issue this week also, because there is the EU-Africa summit, and Macron is doing a big tour to Africa. And I think, a few years ago, no one was really talking about Africa here in Brussels, in the EU bubble. But now it has become a huge issue because of the migration crisis, of course. Yeah. And the countries and leaders of EU countries now understand, of course, what's happening in Africa has a real and dramatic impact on Europe, and you have to talk about it.
So do you think that maybe the EU can be criticised for having a hand in all of this, you could say? Let's not say slavery, of course, but through making deals with third countries to resolve the migration crisis, that in some way this is a consequence of it.
It is criticised for it. I mean, if you speak to people from outside the EU, not just from outside the bubble, but from other countries, they will often express frustration at the way that the EU likes to kind of lecture other countries about human rights, about the way that they do things. This is a key example of ways where they see the EU as being massively hypocritical, that they've set up these deals basically to keep lots of African migrants away, that they've set up these deals that have resulted in these allegations of human slavery in Libya. This is again a really classic story about the good and bad bits of the EU.
So the EU comes across as a hypocrite in your eyes onto the stories we covered. Well, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much, of course, to Danny and Sebastian. Eyes now to Catalonia. Is he a radical, an opportunist, or a master tactician? EU leaders may have washed their hands of Carles Puigdemont, the ousted Catalan president. But what happens if a Belgian judge decides to not uphold the automatic execution of the 5 European arrest warrants issued by Spain on November 3rd for Mr. Puigdemont and his 4 colleagues in Brussels? Caroline Grasso has the latest.
On December 21st, Catalonians will go to the polls. Regional elections were called following the unilateral declaration of independence from Spain by Carles Puigdemont, then Catalan president. In response, the Spanish government suspended the previous autonomy of Catalonia via Article 155 of the Spanish Constitution. Puigdemont and 4 former ministers who fled to Brussels are standing in the elections, but as the Spanish arrest warrant issued against them remains in force, they will campaign from Belgium. Should he win, Puigdemont is demanding that Catalonia's state guardianship under Article 155 be lifted. In Spain, the vote on December 21st is seen as a second referendum on the independence of Catalonia.
Well, joining me to discuss the future of Mr. Puigdemont and how he could possibly contest regional elections in Catalonia on December 21st is Spanish Liberal MEP Ramon Tremosa. Mr. Tremosa, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Now, you are from the same party as Mr. Puigdemont. He and his 4 colleagues have created quite the storm by planting themselves in Brussels, the EU capital. It's raised the temperature between Spain and Belgium, and it's also creating problems for the EU. So what is the end game here?
I disagree. It has not been a storm. All Belgian politicians unified condemning the imprisonment of 8 Catalan ministers. President Puigdemont came to Brussels the 31st of October, and he said, I am escaping not from justice, but from prison, because in Spain there is no independent justice and there are no guarantees. And everybody said, come on, what are you saying? 48 hours later, we saw how 8 Catalan ministers that remain in Barcelona were sent to Madrid, and in a 5-minute discussion with the judge, without trial, were condemned to preventive prison. And this is a tribunal for terrorists, so they can be 4 years in provisional prison before they have a trial. So Puigdemont was right to come here.
So you don't think... so is Mr. Puigdemont a coward or a victim?
No, it's a victim. If he was a coward, he would not have declared independence, because the Catalan path for independence cannot be the Scottish one. We have been trying for years to have an agreed referendum with the Spanish state. All the polls published also by a Spanish newspaper like El País shows that 85% of Catalans want an agreed referendum like in Scotland.
But the voter turnout itself was very small.
And then we proceed unilaterally because we have received so many no's from the other side. And look the violence that the Spanish state used to avoid.
If regions from other member states, for example, we have an issue in Belgium as well, if regions within a member state were to unilaterally go for independence referendums and then to declare independence from their member state.
There is no other situation like Catalonia in Spain, in Europe, because in the last 6 years, in the last 6 elections, pro-independentist parties and pro-referendum parties have won all the elections in Catalonia, obtaining between 60 and 70% of the votes. So the Spanish constitution is offside in Catalonia, and the younger the people is, much more preference for independence. And we, in the last Catalan elections 2 years ago, we had an absolute majority to declare unilaterally independence. And it was,
so are you saying
let me finish.
Yeah.
And 2 years ago, we had the highest turnout ever. And our electoral program was not illegalized in Madrid by Spanish authorities.
But the voter turnout again was low.
No, I repeat, in 2 years' time, 2 years ago, in 2015, the Catalan elections had about 77% of participation, the highest ever in Catalonia. The referendum we had the 1st of October, after the violence of the Spanish police, 10,000 policemen going to dozens of schools beating people, you cannot pretend to have a participation, because a lot of people my mother was at home saying, I cannot go to vote, with police beating also. But, people.
The EU, whether you look at individual leaders, for example, the Belgian Prime Minister, they have condemned all violence.
We really appreciate that.
But the thing is that, coming to the first question again, what is the end game then for Mr. Puigdemont? Does he want Catalonia to be independent from Spain or not? Or do you want more devolved
There are
powers?
3 political parties in the Catalan Parliament that want independence. This is publicly, and it has been for the last years. President Puigdemont is candidate again for these imposed elections that Mr. Rajoy has scheduled for the 21st of December. He may win, as many polls are showing, and he will return. 2 days ago, he said, I will be back in Catalonia if I am again the most voted candidate to become the Catalan president with my electoral program. And then we will see if the Spanish justice will send him to provisional prison, as we have 8 ministers. This is why I'm wearing this yellow.
What if, because obviously whatever Mr. Puigdemont says that he would, let's say his party gets a lion's share in the regional election, but he also has the little matter of an EU arrest warrant. So what if a Belgian judge decides on December 4th, or perhaps they push it later, that they will uphold the EU arrest warrant and send Mr. Puigdemont and his colleagues back to Spain?
The EU warrant against Puigdemont, sent by Spain, it was on corruption. And it was rejected in the first minute by the Belgian justice, because there is no case in corruption against him.
No, but the decision hasn't been taken.
Yes, the decision hasn't been taken.
They have disputed
on rebellion and sedition,
rebellion and
sedition, that in the Spanish penal code is obliged to be associated to violence, and it is not our case. the penalties in Belgium are completely different than the penalties in Spain. In Spain, you can be 35 years in prison. It is not the case of Belgium. Without violence, there is no charge. So I think that the Belgian justice will have a very different outcome than the Spanish one.
Sure, I mean, lots of experts, legal experts, for example, say that double criminality and the same charges are not present in Belgian penal law.
Yes.
But it would be, I mean, the issue of an EU arrest warrant is for the judge to decide and the judge alone. It's not a political issue. But don't you think that if a Belgian judge does not issue this EU arrest warrant, that it would create massive problems between Belgium and Spain?
Why massive problems?
Because it's a massive political issue.
No. It's Prime Minister of Belgium said Puigdemont will be treated as any other European citizen, and let the Belgian justice do the job, analyze the charges against President Puigdemont. We have been always behaving in a peaceful way. The demonstrations that we have had on the National Day every year, all the global correspondents, BBC, New York Times have said, no glass broken, incredibly peaceful behavior, instead of demanding freedom for your country and instead of the provocations of the Spanish state. So we cannot be associated with violence or coup d'etat, as the Spanish says.
And then just lastly, let's just say Mr. Puigdemont and his colleagues are the biggest party in the regional election. If Spain continues to deny the right of self-determination, do you think that the EU will lose patience with Spain and finally speak up or take some action?
The Spanish Constitution recognizes the prevalence of international treaties subscribed by Spain. For instance, the United Nations Charter talks about self-determination right, or the EU treaties talks about you cannot use the military force against peaceful people. Spain is violating these principles. If Europeans remain indifferent, they are undermining EU values.
So do you think that EU unity cannot come at the price of what the people want?
Well, at least Donald Tusk, President of the European Council, clearly have said statements explicitly addressed to the Spanish government condemning any kind of violence and use dialogue. And if we would put a vote in this parliament, do you agree condemning violence? Do you agree with bilateral political negotiations? A huge majority would vote for that. So I think that European countries and European leaders and European citizens, as we see in the press many days, stand for European democracy. And how can you oblige millions of Catalans to continue being Spaniards if they don't want?
Sure. Well, Mr. Schmoser, thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. Thank you so much. And finally, in the outskirts of Brussels, a Belgian-Korean chef is taking the art of cooking to another level, inventing new recipes and tastes by infusing the environment and tradition with a splash of modernity. Let's take a look.
For me, first it's product, second is techniques, but the third, I think the most important, is emotion. And emotion it gives by human. My roots are really important too, because I am coming from Korea, and I try to use techniques from Korea and using the product that I can find here.
Une betterave qui a été cuite 24 heures sous la terre et qui donne un côté fumé, et quand on le coupe on dirait du thon. Le bleu c'est un dashi fait avec quelques gouttes de chou rouge, et quand il est mis en contact avec du sel il devient bleu, et quand il est mis en contact avec de l'acidité il devient rouge. Une petite goutte d'acidité qui représente l'agressivité de l'homme, qui vient perturber l'écosystème, et à chaque fois que vous plongez votre cuillère dans cette assiette, elle devient rouge. C'est un plat engagé, c'est un plat de passionné. C'est ça la passion, c'est aussi parler du produit, mais c'est aussi parler de l'humain. Comment est-ce que tout ce que tu as pu absorber comme apprentissage de la nature peut être retranscrit dans la manière de manager ton équipe? Alors j'ai inventé le terme perma-management. La permaculture du management. C'est quoi de la permaculture? Vous avez dans votre jardin des petites plantes qui n'ont rien à voir ensemble, vous les mettez ensemble. Mais il y en a une qui va apporter l'ombre à l'autre, il y en a une qui va te servir de médecin, l'autre qui va prévenir, attention, il y a des virus. Donc tout ça dans un petit parterre, mais finalement dans votre cuisine, c'est la même chose. L'humain qui fait en sorte que tout ça soit émotionnel et qui vous porte vers le haut.
And some of that food looks too good to eat. Well, that's all we have for you this week. A big thank you to all of our guests from all of us here in Brussels. Take care and bye-bye.